So this is Castlevania II Simon's Quest Revamped, a 2011 fan game from Metroid Quest for personal computers. Yeah, I'm only getting around to playing this one now. Part of it was not having the time, and part of it was simply lack of interest really. From the few YouTube videos I've seen of this game, it just screamed a hodgepodge of recycled elements that vaguely mimicked or revamped Castlevania II Simon's Quest. A game with a somewhat spotty reputation. Some people liked it, more than some people didn't care for it, and then there were the real men who didn't need Nintendo power to beat this game. I know a couple people in that particular group. So Simon's Quest Revamped is supposed to take the NES original, rebuild it from the ground up, and make it better. Does it succeed? Let's just say there are some aspects that feel like an improvement. There are some aspects that feel more or less the same, there are some aspects that feel worse than the NES original, and then there are some things that had me asking myself, why even bother? And be forewarned, some of this might dwell in somewhat nitpicky territory, and that explains the abnormal length of this video, but at the same time, after playing this thing for about a couple days, I got a lot to say about Revamped, and unlike some other folks who are more than willing to praise this thing as the second coming, I'm not feeling as generous or easily impressed for that matter, but let's get on with it. So after Simon Belmont defeated Count Dracula in the original Castlevania game, he began to feel weak and years later would discover that he was placed under a curse, and that the only way to break the curse was to acquire Dracula's 5 body parts, revive him, and defeat him once more. Unfortunately, the Count's minions will do whatever it takes to make sure Dracula is never revived by the Belmont. They're particular about who gets to revive their master. Much like in the original game, there are 3 different endings you could attain depending on how long you take to complete the game. So for the most part, you're traveling over the land, acquiring weapons and items, gathering clues to aid you in your quest, and eventually collecting the 5 body parts of Dracula, which are found in the various mansions in the game. Collecting the body parts will also instill additional abilities should you equip them. Dracula's rib, for example, grants you a shield to deflect fireballs. Dracula's heart persuades the ferryman on Dead River to escort you to another island. Dracula's eyeball allows you to see hidden items. Dracula's nail restores your whip's ability to break certain blocks. And finally, Dracula's ring allows you to do equip Dracula's ring and it enhances the strength of your flame whip at the cost of a couple of hearts per strike. That's actually a bit of a step up because Dracula's ring in the original Simon's Quest served no real purpose, so hey, that's a step up at least. Suffice it to say, if you bear any familiarity with Simon's Quest, then you shouldn't have any problem navigating Revamped's world since it's more or less the same thing. All the level layouts have more or less been meticulously recreated with updated visuals, all the hidden books and merchants are situated in their usual place, the prices for certain items such as whips and laurels cost more or less the same. All the usual secrets can be found the same way, there's really nothing out of the ordinary here. There are a couple minor bits here and there that have been slightly tweaked. For example, you need to buy the diamond instead of being given the diamond. Churches not only restore your health but also save your progress. Yeah, you could save your progress instead of resorting to passwords, that's a step up. And there are now bosses guarding the body parts of Dracula, but you still need an oak stake to shatter the orb and claim the prize. I'm gonna get back to this one later. So let's touch on some positives, because there are good things about Revamped that I actually liked and thought were actual improvements over the original formula. First off, the text. Almost every bit of dialogue has been rewritten and reworked so that it makes more sense. So when you talk to them, there's a good chance they'll provide you with some hints and clues that will steer you towards a certain direction and with a certain purpose, but it's not done in a way where it feels like hand-holding. So if someone tells you a flame flickers in a cave, you'll stumble across a cave and you'll find a flame, it feels like you accomplished something. It's not going to tell you exactly where to find what, but it gives you enough that you could pretty much figure things out on your own. And while bits of the game's original dialogue has been retained, for the most part, the text is given a substantial boost otherwise. And with the expanded dialogue boxes, you get a little more information that was originally constrained in a tiny help box. Again, it's not a particular big deal if you're already familiar with the original game, but it is a notable improvement worth mentioning. Another change that I liked are the churches, as they serve more of a purpose here than just simple healing. Now you could go to a church, you can not only heal, but you could also save your progress. And on top of that, when you load a saved game, you'll restart at the last church you saved at, with all your hearts, experience points, and whatever trinkets you've collected up to that point intact. The only thing that isn't saved is your lives count. Like the original Simon's Quest, you start a game with 3 lives. When you load a saved game, you'll always start with 3 lives, even if you had only 1 left when you last saved the game. Which is a smart move because much like the original game, there are no in-game means of getting extra lives. And unlike the original game, once you lose all your lives, it's game over, no continues, back to the title screen, and everything you've done since your last save is gone, never to be seen again. It's a double-sided deal, but it's a good tweak overall. Whenever you enter a new area, a dialog box will pop up and tell you that area's name. It's small detail that feels extraneous, but for those wondering where they are, it's a useful novelty if nothing else. When you defeat enemies, sometimes they'll drop hearts. Hearts are not only used for currency to buy certain items and also as ammunition for certain weapons, but they also serve as experience points. Naturally, you earn enough experience points and you'll gain a level that equates to greater defense or life bar extensions. Revamped maintains this system more or less, but removes a restriction from the original Simon's Quest in that if you reach a certain level of experience, there are some places where hearts will not earn you experience anymore. Case in point, the first mansion. You grind for hearts, you gain experience, and once you gain a level, any hearts you acquire in that mansion nets you no experience, so you have to go elsewhere to gain experience, presumably a place where there are stronger monsters to beat. In Revamped, if you grind for hearts and experience in that first mansion and you gain a level, you could still grind for hearts and gain experience points in that first mansion. It's a small but otherwise efficient tweak because it no longer feels like a waste of time grinding for hearts and suddenly realizing you're getting nothing out of the deal. You can find a nice spot close by and grind for as many hearts as you like, since you can now collect more than the original's 256 heart max limit, so that's an improvement. Although weapons and items function more or less the same as in the original, there are some tweaks as to their performance. For example, while laurels will grant you temporary invincibility, there's an additional caveat where your attacks are disabled during this time. And, well, fair enough. Laurels in Simon's Quest have often been spammed for certain cases to make them easier than they should have been. When you lay down garlic, it'll shortly disappear after a short turn, unlike the original where you laid garlic and it stayed in that spot the whole time until you scrolled off screen or something. Certain weapons have a bit more range than before. Minor bits, minor details. Control is a mixed bag, and perhaps the one sticking point that sometimes pulled me out of the game, and serves as a harsh reminder that this is indeed a Game Maker creation, because there is that certain feel with the controls that I usually get with Game Maker produced games. Now, generally speaking, Control's pretty good, and in some ways feels like a step up. It's the usual setup: one button whips, the other button jumps. You have one button for throwing whatever weapon you have selected, so there's no need to hold up and B. You could climb up and down stairs as you normally would, and you could control your jump in midair as you would in latter-day Vania games like Castlevania 4. Now, in a way, this feels like a step up, but in another way, it also feels like a step back. In particular, jumping feels somewhat nerfed in that it doesn't reach as high or as wide as one would expect a Belmont jump to feel. The game nails the strut, but the jump, mixed feelings about that. But more than anything, I just wish there was an option to customize your controls. I'm using a gamepad rather than the keyboard, but the button mapping feels odd and I eventually resorted to using an external mapping program like JoyToKey to get the buttons to feel natural as it were, and this is still an imperfect solution. The enemy selection is merely so-so more than anything, replacing the original Simon's Quest incarnations with 16-bit equivalents or in some cases, completely different monsters. And in some cases it works well enough, like the knights and the skeletons, and in other cases it really doesn't. Some enemies act similarly to how they would in the original game, while others are given new attack patterns, oftentimes based on patterns that they used in other Castlevania games. Again, in some cases it works, in other cases, not so much. As much as I enjoyed the giant plant monsters in Revamped, I'm less than thrilled with Skeledragons, especially since Skeledragons in Simon's Quest were more akin to bone pillars in traditional Castlevania. That's just me though. So we covered positives, we covered so-sos, now we touch on negatives, and the best place to start, I feel, is the transition from day to night and vice versa. Now I know what you're thinking. The transition is quick, it's instantaneous, you don't have to wait 10 tedious seconds for a text box, a fade out, and a fade in effect. It's quick and painless. How can you say this is worse than the NES original? And that's a good point. It is a quick thing that happens every 6th and 18th game hour, but if you're on a moving platform and that transition takes place, once that text box is gone, you're falling the fuck down, and what does that mean? You're dead. And this has happened on more than one occasion, so given the option, Yeah, I'll take the 10 tedious seconds if it means I could stand on a floating block without worrying about falling through the damn thing. Bad. Whip combat in general also feels a bit iffy. Yeah, your whip snaps a bit quicker than it did in the original, but when it lands a blow on an enemy, the window of invincibility between hits is so large that if you were to whip at an enemy frantically 8 times, probably only 4 or 5 of those blows would actually register a hit. And this means striking an enemy, causing it to turn red, and then waiting until it regains color to strike again. This is a red flag because in all my experience playing a multitude of Castlevania games that involved a whip, or any semblance of combat for that matter, this was never an issue. If your whip struck an enemy, it landed a hit, and if you struck that enemy 3 times, all 3 would register a hit. Even Castlevania The Adventure on Game Boy followed this basic principle. And on top of that, none of your blows stun the enemy, so not only do you have that window of invincibility that takes 2 years that you have to wait for to wear off to land another blow, but the enemy will be unfazed and still move forward like nothing's happened. I'd hardly call that a step above Simon's Quest's meager combat. If anything, it feels a bit worse. The ferryman at Dead River in Simon's Quest takes you to the other side, never stops. You'll need to jump off when you reach the other side because if you don't, you'll just move back and forth between islands. Sometimes it feels like a waste of time. The ferryman at Dead River in Revamped goes to the other side, comes to a dead stop, and doesn't move until you vacate the premises. It's a minor detail, but it feels faster and more fluid on the NES, especially if you're trying to beat the damn clock, which, if you want the best ending, you have to beat the game as quickly as possible. And indeed, it feels like some tweaks were made specifically to slow you down or to make you waste more time than you would in the original version. And then we get to the bosses. The one thing that everybody wanted, and suddenly this makes this game better, except it really doesn't. Bear with me here. In the original Simon's Quest, to acquire a body part of Dracula in each of the 5 mansions, you had to buy an oak stake from a merchant, find the flashing orb, break it with the stake, and there's your body part. Revamp more or less follows the same formula, but now in order to gain access to that orb, you now have to fight a boss. Yeah, there are actually bosses guarding the body parts of Dracula. Fairly simple patterns, but relatively challenging affairs if you're not prepared. And once you beat the boss, you can now claim your prize. Provided you bought the oak stake to shatter the orb to claim said prize. What? Most players feel the additional bosses are an improvement, adding to the overall challenge and also adding something that the original Simon's Quest lacked. And let's be honest, outside of the final encounter with the Count, you only had 2 bosses, Death and Carmilla. Death in particular now feels like a boss fight, and that's an improvement. Carmilla more or less is the same thing as in the original, but moves about quicker, takes more hits, and in turn drags the fight out a little longer, but it's a good opportunity to grind for hearts. But here's the thing. As much as Simon's Quest lacked boss battles and that made it feel a bit barren at times, and I enjoy Simon's Quest for what it is, and I can admit that, Revamped's boss battles simply lack purpose. Sure, killing Death and Carmilla still nets you the Golden Knife and the Cross respectively as in the original game, but killing the Bat, the Minotaur, and the Giant Blob nets you hearts or nothing. And even with that out of the way, you still need to stake the ball to get the body part, so what's the point? You fight a boss, you figure out the pattern, you put up a good fight, and you eventually beat the boss. Time to claim the prize, but wait, you still need an oak stake to claim said prize. Am I really the only one who sees how stupid this is? There's a couple other tidbits here that had me scratching my head. Holy Water now has its trademark explosive effect that was prevalent in virtually any Castlevania offering you'll come across, but was lacking in Simon's Quest. While this might seem like a cool idea in a visual sense, in practice, not so much. Holy Water still dissolves certain blocks, but it's still a one-hit weapon and the explosion doesn't do anything beyond looking pretty. Aesthetically it looks good, but again, what's the point if it doesn't do anything? Especially with the 2-year-long invincibility window between hits. So up to this point, it seems like I've been really nitpicky, and if that's somehow crossed your mind, I did warn you at the beginning of this video. But these are just bits and boobs that I noticed as I was playing Revamped, and it brought about a variety of things that I thought were either good or not so good, or I just simply questioned the intent. And while I have sticking points regarding some of the revamping, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy Revamped. If you didn't look too deep into things, it's a very respectable conversion of Simon's Quest with some tweaks and bells and whistles added. But at the same time, once I finished playing Revamped, I immediately found myself playing the original Simon's Quest on NES, and quite frankly had a much better time with that, flaws and all. Perhaps the reason why I didn't enjoy Revamped as much as I enjoyed Simon's Quest in its original form is because Revamped feels almost like a carbon copy with only minor additions. Like I said before, if you bore any familiarity with the NES game, you'll be able to blow through this just as easily because it's the same thing, and I can't help but think there was a missed opportunity here in not only trying to fix certain things, but maybe even expand on certain aspects, whether that meant additional weapons and tools not featured in the original game, or maybe new levels or something that feels substantial and more worthwhile than just, well, Simon's Quest didn't have bosses, let's just add bosses cause fuck. That's perhaps the one sticking point above all else that dampers Revamped a bit, because it is a PC game and not a mere ROM hack where you're limited by the resources available to you. A little something extra would have been nice, and would have made this a little better and worthwhile. For the most part, Revamped looks the part. A 16-bit reskinning of the original Simon's Quest. This is naturally achieved through lots of graphical elements and sprite work ripped from other games such as Dracula X, Rondo of Blood, Symphony of the Night, a couple GBA titles even. So it has that whole Recyclevania feel that, in fairness, a lot of these fan games have, and at the very least, it's done in a way that it doesn't look like a mess. It's presentable, it looks about as good as a typical official game, save for the obnoxious fog background that pops up during nighttime segments. That looks pretty bad. Maybe if there was a transparency involved or something, it would have been a little better, but as it is, it's pretty bad. And in fairness, there is an attempt to give some of these areas, which looked a little samey in the original, some uniqueness to them, whether it be giving the mansions different backdrops or blocks, or giving the towns different backgrounds in the background, and I'm being redundant here, but you know, just minor graphical touches that make them distinct and noteworthy, or something, I guess, I don't know. If there was a complaint to be had visually speaking, it's that Revamped relies too much on recycling and fails to add in something new or fresh. Yeah, Simon looks like he did on the cover, but that's only on a later revision. The original Revamped release has the audacity to recolor Richter Belmont red and call it Simon. And that was rectified rather quickly, fortunately. There's a couple bits that look new, such as the stake and other minor bits, and apparently the Thorn Whip looks like a proper Thorn Whip, but I've never seen it since I usually just go straight for the Chain Whip, which almost looks like a Morning Star Whip, and even the Morning Star doesn't look at all different from the Chain Whip. Maybe a little extra length, but that's about it. Again, this Recyclevania mentality is a common trait with many fan games of various ilks, so it is to be expected, but at the same time, it would have been nice to see some original takes on certain aspects. You know, like Dracula. Dracula may not look like Dracula in Simon's Quest, but I understood the idea behind it somewhat, and I wouldn't have minded an enhanced version that made it look somewhat like Dracula. Sort of a decaying Dracula, if you will, like in Vampire Killer on MSX. But instead, it's just Dracula from Rondo of Blood with an attack pattern that doesn't fit visually, and it just doesn't work for me. Revamped features sound effects ripped from other Castlevania games and a MIDI interpretation of the original Simon's Quest soundtrack. Not much to say about the sound effects, they're ripped from other games, and they somewhat mimic what they're supposed to. The sound quality is all over the place though. It seems like some sounds are louder than others and some sounds are quieter than others. As for the music, it's MIDI based. It sounds somewhat decent in some cases, somewhat lacking in others, but it's something. Though personally, I feel it lacks the punch of the original NES chiptunes, but again, that's just me. Now here's the deal. Is Castlevania II Simon's Quest Revamped a good Castlevania fan game? Without question. I've played a few of these fan games, some decent ones, some not so decent ones, and Revamped is certainly a high quality fan game that has a lot of heart and a lot of effort put into it to make a truly worthwhile Castlevania adventure from a fan game standpoint. And for what it is, I actually did enjoy myself quite a bit playing this, and despite some misgivings, I thought Metroid Quest did a solid job of recreating the world of Simon's Quest and giving it a few minor touches to make it a little more or less here. That having been said, at the end of the day, given the choice between playing this or Simon's Quest, I'd much rather be playing Simon's Quest. Revamp's tweaks and modifications might seem like minor improvements or in some cases minor detriments, but ultimately feels content in providing players with a straight 16-bit facelift of the original Simon's Quest without adding anything a little more substantial to make the game feel worthwhile. And no, the totally superfluous boss battles do not count as anything substantial. It is an interesting curiosity that is worth giving a try once or twice just to see what it's all about. It is a freebie after all, and chances are you might take more of a liking to it than I did. But Simon's Quest Revamped is a decent little fan game that has its moments, but it won't be replacing the NES game anytime soon.